Before I really look and move in this sermon, there's a matter that needs to be addressed. There's a rumor going around of a man, a follower of Jesus Christ, that has slipped from the faith. And after years of walking with Christ, it was said that he publicly, before a noted group of ministers, openly confessed his doubts about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I'm quite sure that every person in this room has heard of this man. He is well known in the Christian community. It was said that this evangelical minister openly denied Jesus' resurrection, and that's a pretty serious charge. Is it true? Sadly, it is true that this minister of Jesus Christ did question the validity of the resurrection. It's also unfortunate that this man could never shake the label given to him by believers everywhere because of this one moment of questioning. I believe he was given a label that is unfair. I mean, is it right to think we know the measure of a person on the basis of what they have or have not done on one occasion? Would you? Would I want to be characterized by one or two of our responses? I believe the Christian community has been just too hard on this man. Who is this man? His name is Thomas. No, his first name's not Doubting. But that's how we think of him. I mean, it's almost impossible to say his name Thomas without adding the label Doubting. I mean, we love categories. We love labels. We like our boxes. And so we say things like, he's a Baptist. She's Catholic. She's seeing a counselor. Single mom. Divorced. Alcoholic. Troubled teenager. Depressed. Homeless. Wealthy. Doubting Thomas. Doubting Thomas. Thomas is one who gets put into this box of doubt, but the shoe fits all the other disciples. So look with me in your Bibles to John chapter 20. John chapter 20. And before we zero in on this incident in Thomas's life, I want to go back with me to the scene moments earlier when a band of men, the disciples of Jesus, were locked up in a house. So John chapter 20, let's look at verse 19. It says, on the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, now note this, with the doors locked for fear of the Jews. Don't tell me they didn't have any doubts. These disciples had no welcome back Jesus banner hanging from their house. They were locked up in fear. And do you know what it's like to be locked up in fear? And when those fears, how do these fears subside? Well, in their case, Jesus shows up. He walks through the locked doors. It tells us that in verse 19. Now, a Sunday school teacher just finished telling her third graders about how Jesus was crucified and then placed in the tomb with a great stone sealing the opening. And then wanting to share the excitement of the resurrection, she asked her students, and what do you suppose was Jesus' first words when he came out of that tomb alive? Well, a hand shot up of a little girl, and she jumped in her chair, and she said, I know what his first words were. Oh, said the teacher, tell us, what do you think were Jesus' first words? And extending her arm, she said, ta-da! I think that's what I might have done. To everybody I saw, ta-da, I'm still here. Well, Jesus entered through the door into the house where the disciples were staying, and his first words were not that. His first words are found in verse 19. Jesus came, stood among them, and said, Shalom, peace be with you. It is only after he proves to them by his nail holes and the spear marks that he is the same Jesus do their fears turn to joy. Now, they may not have verbalized their doubts, but it is safe to say they had them, or else they wouldn't have been in hiding. And remember, Mary Magdalene already told them, I have seen the Lord, back in verse 18. I have seen the Lord, she tells them. And her testimony, apart from their seeing Jesus with their own eyes, did not convince them. Now, verse 24 informs us that Thomas was not with them when Jesus appeared. And I just have to ask, where was Thomas? We're not sure. We can only speculate. But just maybe, he's the kind of guy who needed to be alone in times like this. He just lost his friend. The one he had put he staked his hopes in, the person he followed for a few years, died. So he's grieving. And not everyone grieves in the same way. He was alone by himself, perhaps. I don't know. But for whatever reason, Thomas wasn't with the other 10 disciples when Jesus showed up. And to this point, he did not have the benefit of seeing Jesus. The other disciples tried to tell him that Jesus was in fact alive. Verse 25, for example, says the other disciples told him. And you know, the force of that language there kept telling him, Thomas, he's alive, he's alive, he's alive, he's alive. I mean, you can't blame them. They're just filled with excitement. Their hearts were racing. Their adrenaline was on the high, and they were just flying high at this point. I mean, you know how it is when you just can't contain your excitement about what Jesus means to you and how he showed up in your life, only to find that as you're sharing that excitement with someone, they're just kind of looking at you like you got two heads. They don't share it with the same excitement. The disciples try to tell Thomas what was going on, and really their first witnessing effort failed. Because Thomas replies in the middle of verse 25, he says, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it. You see, Thomas knew better. He saw Jesus die. And Thomas isn't asking for anything more than what the others saw. Listen, Thomas, like the others, had pinned his hopes on Jesus Christ. And when Jesus died, his hopes died. Thomas dreamed that this Jesus would be the deliverer for the nation Israel. And when Jesus died, his dreams died. So he wants to move on. He doesn't want to keep hope and dreams alive, but to let Jesus go. I mean, sure, around town the word is Jesus is alive, but enough is enough. Let Jesus rest in peace. Don't keep talking about him. Thomas wanted his belief to be rooted in something more than wishful thinking or on a rumor. And no doubt this is a moment of doubt for Thomas. But again, I ask you, would you want to be characterized by one or two of your responses in life? Would you want that label on you because of one or two times in how you responded? Particularly, you responded in a time of tremendous grief and pain, and that's what he's going through. Thomas's doubt is one that often haunts us behind closed doors. I mean, who in this room has never doubted? There are differing opinions as to the presence of doubt and what it represents in a believer's life. Martin Luther called doubt the monster of uncertainty and the gospel of despair. On the other hand, Lord Tennyson spoke of doubt this way. He says, there lives more faith in honest doubt, believe me, than in half the creeds. Although doubts can be an excuse for unbelief, they can also push us to greater faith. While it is true if we indulge doubt, it can turn corrosive, it can also bring us to our knees, forcing us to trust him. So I ask you this morning, how do you deal with your doubts? How do you deal with your doubts? Well, I believe this passage here and Thomas's example provides us with some timeless lessons on how we're to deal with doubts. First of all, lesson number one is it takes courage to face your doubts. It takes courage to face your doubts. Doubting Thomas, you say? I remind you of a scene from Jesus' life. Jesus and his disciples were discussing going to Judea. And Jesus had just announced that he was going to go to Judea, and the disciples responded, my paraphrase, "Are you crazy? You're going to get yourself killed if you go there." It's at this point in the discussion, after the disciples said this, that Thomas, doubting Thomas, jumps in and he says, "Let us also go that we may die with him." Courageous Thomas. Now, why didn't that label stick? Again, in John 14, after Jesus speaks of going to prepare a place for his followers, only Thomas has the courage to question that and say, "Lord, we do not know where you're going. How do we know the way?" That is an excellent question, by the way. It prompted one of the clearest directions to salvation. For Jesus answered that brilliant question with, "I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Courageous Thomas. It takes courage to ask hard questions. It takes courage to face our doubts. Don't pretend they don't exist. Don't be afraid to admit those wrestling points. Don't hide behind Christian cliches. Because in the midst of your doubts, don't give up too soon. Keep pushing through it. Put your questions to reliable sources. Go to your knees and humbly lay it all out before God. You know, because in the Christian community, we might not dare express our doubts. I mean, look what happened to the last guy who did. We still know him as Doubting Thomas. See, I suggest to you, it takes courage to face your doubts. If you're there this morning, face it. Face it. Walk through it. Walk through it. Second timeless lesson, I need to move on. Second timeless lesson is Jesus wants to meet you at the crossroad of your doubts. Jesus wants to meet you at the crossroad of your doubts. Out on the mission field, the children of this missionary family were being called in for dinner. And the mother said to her children, "Now remember, be sure to wash your hands before coming to the table for dinner." The little boy scowled and said, "Germs and Jesus, germs and Jesus. That's all I hear, and I've never seen either one of them." Thomas wanted to see Jesus. Thomas had heard of Jesus being alive, but he hadn't seen him yet. And Jesus knew precisely what Thomas had said previously about what it would take for him to believe. And Jesus meets him at that very point. Look at verse 27. Look at verse 27. Actually, go back to 26. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Verse 27. Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands, reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Jesus comes and he shows Thomas his battle wounds. What's the antidote to doubt? Seeing his wounds, trusting and believing in those wounds. The text doesn't tell us whether or not Thomas actually went ahead and touched Jesus here. It doesn't say. Seeing him might have been enough. Christ demonstrates his victory over death, not with an act of strength, but with his wounds. Nail holes and spear marks. And you know, we tend to long for the carnival God. The God who performs his sleight of the hand tricks. And we want that Jesus, the one who feeds the crowds. We like that Jesus. We want the one who heals the lepers, and we want the one who walks on water, and he does all these things. That's the Jesus we want. And he shows us his wounds. He shows us his wounds. Has your faith been wounded? Jesus shows you his wounds. Do you feel like what you're going through right now is too much? Jesus shows you his wounds. Are you here today filled with all kinds of doubts because of a past hurt by someone in the Christian community, and you say, I can't take that anymore, and I don't want anything to do with the church because of that individual. Jesus shows you his wounds. He shows you his wounds. You see, when life becomes messy, it really can disturb our faith. When we reach the limits of our understanding, doubts can show up. When a respected leader falls, or when we do what is right and we suffer miserably for it, or when a young life is taken, when the words of a professor seem to make more sense than what we've always been taught, when we encounter some difficult situation or some tragedy in our life, when we receive one blow after another, we find ourselves at the crossroad of doubts. Unless I mean, have you ever said that? Unless I see God answer this prayer, I'm not going to believe. Unless I can make sense of what happened, I'm not going to believe. Unless I can get an answer to my question, why, Lord? I don't want anything to do with him. Unless I see this Christian make it right, unless how would you fill that in? What's your unless I? Are you indulging doubt? Are you doubting as an excuse to not believe and to stay right where you are? What unless I has you kind of stuck right now? Honestly, face it, Christ will meet you there. Use your doubt to drive you to him and seek him with all your heart. Don't allow your doubt to drive you to isolation from others. I mean, it could be argued here that Thomas's withdrawal from all the other disciples put him in a place where he missed out on the blessing of Jesus showing up the first time. And sadly, some have not found in the Christian community to be that safe place where they can share their honest doubts and admit their struggles and wrestle with a question. So instead what they do is they withdraw from Christian fellowship. They give up on the church as a whole to never fight through their doubts. Do you stand at the crossroad of doubt this morning? Honest doubts. Jesus is alive and he wants to show up in your life. Does. He wants to meet you at the crossroad of your doubt. He wants to meet you there. Don't give up too soon. And that really brings us to the third timeless lesson. Fight through your doubts to certainty. Fight through your doubts to certainty. Courageous Thomas fights through his doubt to a rock-solid certainty and faith. And we come to Thomas's powerful profession in verse 28. Thomas says to Jesus, my Lord and my God. My Lord and my God. Now, it seems as though Thomas never did put his finger and touch Jesus' hands inside. It appears that Thomas's first response to seeing Jesus was not to touch Jesus, but to worship him. My Lord and my God, he exclaims. Now, Thomas said a mouthful here, by the way. And notice, Jesus does not correct Thomas's statement. He doesn't attempt to modify it in any way. And if Jesus wasn't God, then Thomas should have been rebuked for his blasphemy. He was not rebuked. Well, because what he says here is true. Jesus is God. Jesus is Lord. You see, when confronted with the risen Christ, Thomas's problem has now found a resolution. When confronted with the risen Christ, his doubts are satisfied. And so do you have a doubt this morning? Fight through it. See how it holds up next to the risen Christ. One man expressed it this way. He said, you know what I think? Anyone who walks out of his own grave is whoever he says he is. That's true. So where you have a question mark of doubt, the risen Christ wants to turn it into an exclamation point of certainty. Now Jesus then shifts focus from Thomas to all future believers throughout the ages. It says one man described as a shift in focus from those on the stage to those in the audience watching the drama unfold. And just before the curtain falls, the house lights go on, and the focus is on the audience. For Thomas, seeing was believing. For the followers in Jesus' day, seeing was believing. Jesus was counting on his eyewitnesses to spread the word for generations to come. Christianity could not move forward unless his disciples were convinced beyond any shadow of a doubt that he was alive. See, Jesus did not rise from the dead to then immediately enter into heaven. Acts 1, for example, says Jesus showed himself to these men and gave many convincing proofs that he was alive. He appeared to them over a period of 40 days. And in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says of Jesus, he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. And after that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living. In other words, in a 6-week period following his resurrection, Jesus made himself known to over 500 people. People who are still living when the testimony was being written and spoken about, who could vouch that it is true. Now, a room full of over 500 people in a courtroom as eyewitnesses to an event would be a no-brainer for a jury. It would be a slam dunk. Jesus placed in the hands of these witnesses the good news of his sacrifice for the sins of the world and the hope of eternal life in him. And if they did not go forward with the good news, the story would have ended there. It was critical for them to see him alive. Your salvation depended upon it. I ask, as he mentions here in verse 29, because you have seen me, you believe. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Are you one of those called blessed? And maybe you are and you're still wrestling with some doubts of your own. Look to his wounds. He knows your pain. He knows where you are in your doubts right now. He's your wounded healer. If you know him, then the power of the risen Christ lives in you. So keep fighting through those doubts. Don't give up too soon, because honest doubts can lead and will lead to certainty. So what's the path of blessedness for us? What's the path of blessedness? Is it a quest for proof? See, there's a basic flaw of all doubt. It can never be fully satisfied. It will always crave for more. And so using doubt as an excuse will never be satisfied, no matter how much more proof is given. In the biblical account of the rich man and a man named Lazarus, the rich man who had seen in hell, who's in hell, pleads in torment to have Lazarus resurrected from the dead and be sent to warn his 5 brothers. And he reasons, he says this, if someone from the dead goes to them, my brothers will repent. And the response to the man's request is this, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. See, a refusal to be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead, where does that leave you? It leaves you stuck in unbelief. It leaves you stuck in unbelief. It'll never be satisfied. The Discovery Channel ran a documentary back a few years ago called The Lost Tomb of Christ. They were claiming that they discovered a burial box that may have contained the bones of Jesus. Now, how many times must we go around this block? Because back in 1996, the British Broadcasting Corporation aired a short documentary on the same subject. And many archaeologists challenged the claims right then. And USA Today, for example, speaks of an archaeologist who was the first one to examine the site. And this archaeologist says, the claim fails to hold up by archaeological standards, but makes for profitable television. At least he's honest. A biblical scholar at the University of the Holy Land in Jerusalem said that the film's hypothesis holds little weight. And he goes on to say, skeptics in general would like to see something that pokes holes into the story of the resurrection that so many people hold dear. Now, by the way, sometime later after this claim there to discover the burial box that contained the bones of Jesus, Israel charged 5 suspects with forgery in connection with the infamous bone box. You don't say. See, there's a difference between honest doubt and using doubt as an excuse for unbelief. Do you have doubts? Do you have honest doubts? Let it drive you to find out who he really is, because it can transform your life. You can be sure that the grave is not the end. You can have the blessed assurance of where you will spend eternity. When confronted with a risen Christ, your doubt can turn to certainty. Because blessed, he says, are those who have not seen and yet have believed. It's with the eyes of faith we believe. It's addressing all those who have never physically seen Jesus, and that would be everyone in this room. You're blessed by believing and not seeing. Jonathan Dobson speaks of the resurrection as a dividing line, and he illustrates that dividing line this way. He says the resurrection is like a river that parts a road. People are on the road approaching this river. Arriving at the river of the resurrection, you look across to where the road continues, and you see quite a few cars are there on the other side. In your doubt, you can't imagine how people got to the other side of the river. How did they get across? How can rational people come to the belief that Jesus died and rose from the dead? Well, faith is the unnoticed ferry lying hidden near the bank of the river that can take us from the riverbank of doubt to the other side of belief in the resurrection. But it's not blind faith. You don't cross by closing your eyes and just wishing Jesus' resurrection was true. No, you cross with your eyes wide open. See, it's an informed faith. Faith in an historical, plausible resurrection attested by hundreds of witnesses, one proven to be worth believing. Blessed are those who have not seen, but by faith have believed. Are you one of the blessed? Are you one of the blessed? Now, perhaps you're not considered one of the blessed this morning. You still have yet to make that decision to trust Jesus for your salvation. You still have all kinds of questions and all kinds of doubts. Perhaps what you've rejected this morning is not Jesus, but a caricature of Jesus. Perhaps you put all Christians in this box. You gave them a label, and in doing so, you refused to examine the claims of Christ for yourself. As George Buttrick, the former chaplain of Harvard, was noted as saying, he said, "Sit down and tell me what kind of God you don't believe in. I probably don't believe in that God either." It is surprising to me how many people shoot down the claims of Christ, yet have never opened this up. Oh, it's just all a bunch of baloney. Have you read it? It's all a bunch of contradictions. Show me. Have you opened it up? You're just going by what others are saying. Read the Gospel of John. Read the Gospel of Mark for yourself. See what the claims of Christ. Go there with an open mind. You just might discover that Jesus doesn't fit into your box. Someone said Easter means we can never nail him down, not even if the nails are real and the thing we nail him to is a cross. Don't miss seeing who he is. Honest doubts. If the heart is not truthful, then the very truth of Jesus Christ is missed. If the heart is not truthful, then the very truth of Jesus Christ is missed. Case in point, Carl Sagan, fascinated by the phenomenon that educated adults. He had the wonders of science manifest all around him. He could cling to beliefs based on the unverifiable testimony of observers dead for 2,000 years. He once exclaimed to cleric Joan Brown Campbell, he said to her, "You're so smart, why do you believe in God?" She found this a surprising question from someone who had no trouble accepting the existence of black holes, which no one has ever observed. She answered, "You're so smart, why don't you believe in God?" His wife, Anne, Carl Sagan's wife, Anne, said there was no deathbed conversion, no appeals to God, no hope for an afterlife, no pretending that he and I, who had been inseparable for 20 years, were not saying goodbye forever. Carl Sagan's wife was asked about her husband, Carl, Did he want to believe? Did he want to believe? And she answered, no, Carl never wanted to believe. If the heart is not truthful, then the very truth of Jesus Christ is missed. And Carl Sagan never wavered in his agnosticism. He took it to his grave with him. I'll take Thomas and his doubts any day. Any day.